Part 1. The galaxy was old, older than most species could truly understand. Stars had been born and died 1,000 times over, and civilizations had risen and fallen like waves on an endless shore. But for the last 900,000 years, one thing had remained constant. The conclave of 12 ruled everything. 12 species, 12 empires. Each one had fought and bled and crawled their way up from nothing to become masters of the stars. They had survived ice ages and asteroid impacts. They had outlasted predators and plagues. They had built ships that could cross the void between stars and weapons that could crack planets like eggs. And when they finally met each other out there in the black, they had fought terrible wars that lasted for thousands of years. But eventually they stopped fighting, not because they had learned to love each other, but because they had learned to fear each other. No single species could destroy all the others, and so they made peace. A cold peace built on mutual suspicion and careful balance. The conclave met once every 100 years to settle disputes and divide territories. It was not friendship, it was survival. There were the warriors of the conclave. Their ships were the largest, their weapons the most powerful. They had evolved on a world of constant conflict where only the strongest survived. They stood 8 feet tall with 4 arms and skin like stone. Their philosophy was simple. The strong ruled, the weak served, and that was the natural order of things. There were the opposite, small and fragile, with bodies that looked like glass and minds that worked like machines. They had survived not through strength but through knowledge. They built networks of information that spanned 10,000 star systems. They knew secrets that other species had forgotten they ever had. When they spoke, others listened, because they always knew more than they should. There were something else entirely. They looked almost like plants with bodies that grew and changed throughout their long lives, but they were not peaceful. They had mastered biology the way others had mastered metal and fire. They could create plagues that targeted specific species. They could grow weapons inside their own bodies. They could change themselves to survive almost anything. Other species feared them, and they liked it that way. These 3 were the most powerful of the 12, but the others mattered too. There were the who lived for thousands of years and thought in patterns that younger species could not understand. There were the burning ones, who existed inside stars and rarely spoke to anyone at all. There were species of gas and species of crystal, species that swam through vacuum like fish through water, species that had abandoned their original bodies entirely and lived as patterns of light. Together, they ruled the galaxy, and they were very careful about who else they allowed to rise. The survey drones were everywhere, millions of them, scattered across the spiral arms, watching and waiting. Most of the time, they found nothing but empty rocks and dead worlds. Sometimes they found life, but usually it was just bacteria or simple creatures that would never become anything more. Occasionally, very occasionally, they found something intelligent. When that happened, the conclave had procedures. If the species was weak enough, they were studied and then mostly left alone. Sometimes they destroyed themselves, which was convenient. Sometimes they survived long enough to be useful, at which point they might be absorbed into one empire or another as servants or workers. And sometimes, if they showed signs of becoming dangerous, they were eliminated. It was not cruelty. It was simply the way things worked. The galaxy had room for only so many apex predators, and the 12 were quite enough. So when Drone 447 Theta returned footage from a small yellow star at the edge of the galactic arm, no one expected anything special. The third planet from that star was wet and blue, covered in water and wrapped in a thin layer of breathable atmosphere. The dominant species was bipedal, carbon-based, warm-blooded. They had discovered agriculture approximately 10,000 years ago and had developed industrial technology within the last 2 centuries. Standard progression. Nothing remarkable. Ambassador of the was assigned to conduct the evaluation. She had done this work for 300 years and had seen dozens of species come and go. Most were disappointing. A few had been interesting. None had been truly surprising. She expected this assignment to be no different. She was wrong. Her ship entered the system quietly, hidden behind screens that bent light and absorbed radiation. She took up position near the fourth planet, a cold red world that the natives called Mars, and began her observations. What she saw in the first hour confused her. What she saw in the first day disturbed her. What she saw in the first week changed everything she thought she knew. The species called themselves humans. They lived on a world they called Earth, and nothing about them made sense. They had no unified government. Instead, they had hundreds of separate nations that competed and cooperated in patterns that seemed almost random. They spoke thousands of different languages. They practiced thousands of different religions. They had been fighting each other since before they had learned to write, and they showed no signs of stopping. They had developed nuclear weapons, devices capable of destroying entire cities in a single flash of light. And then, this was the part that makes blood run cold, they had actually used them. On themselves, on their own species, on their own planet. Not once but twice, and they had come close to using them many more times since. By every metric they used to evaluate species, humans should have been a failure. They were violent, divided, short-sighted, and self-destructive. Their individual were laughably brief, barely a century even for their healthiest members. They made decisions based on emotion rather than logic. They waged wars over ideas that existed only in their minds, invisible concepts like honor and freedom and faith that could not be measured or touched. And yet, watch them land on their moon. Their first attempts had been barely 50 years earlier, crude rockets that could barely escape their own atmosphere. Now they were walking on another world, planting flags and collecting rocks and staring up at the stars with a hunger that made her shiver. They had achieved in 50 years what most species took 5,000 to accomplish. She watched them cure diseases. Plagues that had killed millions of them for centuries were simply erased through determination and ingenuity. They did not wait for evolution to solve their problems. They solved them themselves, in decades rather than. She watched them create art. This was perhaps the most confusing part. They painted pictures and wrote stories and made music, pouring their brief lives into works that would outlast them by centuries. Had seen art from 100 species, but she had never seen anything like this. Human art did not just represent things. It made her feel things. It reached into her mind and twisted something there, leaving her changed in ways she could not describe. She watched them love. This was a concept they understood only in the abstract, a biochemical process designed to encourage pair bonding and reproduction. But humans seemed to experience it differently. They loved with a ferocity that bordered on madness. They sacrificed everything for the people they loved, their time and their comfort, and sometimes their lives. They mourned their dead with rituals that seemed excessive, weeping and wailing over the loss of individuals who had lived their natural span. And she watched them hope. This was the strangest thing of all. Despite everything, despite the wars and the plagues and the countless ways they had hurt each other, they kept hopping. They believed against all evidence that tomorrow could be better than today. They built monuments to futures they would never see. They planted trees whose shade they would never enjoy. They raised children and taught them to hope in turn. Spent 6 months observing Earth. She recorded everything, analyzed everything, cross-referenced everything with the databases that held 900,000 years of accumulated knowledge. At the end of her study, she wrote her report. It was not long. The valued precision and had always been precise. She described the humans in detail, their biology, their psychology, their social structures, their technology. She included projections for their future development based on standard models. And then, at the end, she added her recommendation. She marked it with 3 underlines, the notation for absolute certainty, a marking she had used only twice before in her 300-year career. The recommendation was simple. Do not engage, do not provoke. Do not allow them to know we exist until we understand what we are dealing with. This species is unlike anything in our records. They are not simply dangerous. They are something we have never seen before. They adapt, they change, they grow, and they do it faster than should be possible. We do not know their limits because they do not appear to have any. Proceed with extreme caution. She transmitted her report to the conclave and waited. The council reviewed her findings and agreed with her assessment. They found the biological data fascinating and requested further study. They, in their ancient way, suggested patience and observation over centuries. But they had a different opinion. Admiral of the War Council read the report and laughed. A species that had not even left its own star system. A species that fought amongst itself with primitive weapons. A species whose individuals lived barely 100 years. The ambassador was clearly mistaken. This was not a threat. This was prey. He requested and received authorization for a subjugation fleet. 147 warships, more than enough to conquer any primitive world. He expected the operation to take less than a week. The fleet departed for Earth 3 months later. Received word of the deployment and felt something she had not felt in centuries, dread. She tried to send warnings, but they did not listen. They never listened. They were the strong, and the strong ruled. That was the natural order of things. She could only watch and wait, and hope that she was wrong about the humans. Deep down, she knew she was not. Part 2. The fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel at the edge of the human solar system. 147 warships hung in the darkness, their hulls black and angular, their weapons primed and ready. Admiral stood on the bridge of the flagship Dominion, watching the blue planet grow larger in the display screens. It looked so small, so fragile, so easy. The humans had detected them almost immediately, which was mildly impressive. Their primitive sensors had spotted the energy signatures of the fleet's arrival and had begun broadcasting signals into space. Some were clearly military communications, encrypted in ways that the intelligence officers cracked within minutes. Others were scientific, filled with wonder and confusion. And others still were civilian broadcasts, panicked voices asking what was happening and whether they should be afraid. Found this amusing. Yes, little creatures, you should be very afraid. He ordered a transmission sent to the planet's surface. The message was simple, translated into every major human language. Surrender unconditionally within 12 hours or face orbital bombardment of your population centers. Resistance would be punished. Cooperation would be rewarded with survival. It was the standard offer. Most species accepted it. The few that didn't learned quickly that they did not make empty threats. The humans did not respond. Waited an hour, then 2. His officers monitored the planet's communications and reported that the humans were not ignoring the message. They were debating it. Their various nations were arguing with each other about how to respond, whether to fight or surrender or attempt negotiation. It was chaos down there, dozens of governments all talking at once and none of them agreeing on anything. This only confirmed what already believed. These creatures were weak and divided. They could not even unite in the face of extinction. They would fall easily. He was about to order the countdown to bombardment when something strange happened. The signals from the planet changed. The arguing stopped. All at once, across every nation and every language, the same message began to repeat. It was short, only a few words, and when heard the translation, he did not understand it at all. No. That was it, just no. No surrender, no negotiation, no discussion. Simply no. And then the planet went dark. Not literally dark. The lights of the city still burned. But every military communication, every radar installation, every sensor pointing toward space suddenly went silent. The humans had stopped transmitting anything that might give away their positions or their plans. They had become invisible in every way that mattered. Felt the first small flicker of uncertainty. This was not how prey behaved. Prey ran or surrendered or begged for mercy. Prey did not go quiet and wait. He pushed the feeling aside. It did not matter what the humans did. They had no ships capable of reaching his fleet, no weapons capable of threatening it. They could hide all they wanted. It would not save them. He gave the order to advance. The fleet moved into the inner system, past the gas giants and the asteroid belt, toward the small rocky worlds near the yellow star. They were halfway to Earth when the first ship died. It was a cruiser on the outer edge of the formation. One moment it was there, running normally, its crew of 300 going about their duties. The next moment it was gone, replaced by an expanding cloud of debris and radiation. There had been no warning, no sensor contact, no sign of any attack. The ship had simply ceased to exist. Demanded answers. His officers had none. They reviewed the sensor logs and found nothing. No missile launch, no energy beam, no projectile of any kind. The cruiser had been destroyed by something invisible, something they could not detect or track or understand. 3 more ships died in the next hour. By the time the fleet reached Earth orbit, had lost 11 vessels and still did not know how. His officers were afraid now, though they tried to hide it. They jumped at shadows and spoke in hushed voices. They were born to war, trained to fight since childhood. They did not fear battle, but this was not battle. This was something else. Then the humans showed themselves. It happened all at once. 17 bright flashes erupted in orbit around the planet, so close to the fleet that even the sensors could not miss them. For a moment, thought the humans had launched missiles, and he almost laughed at the futility of it. His ships could destroy any primitive projectile long before it reached them. But these were not missiles. They were bombs. Nuclear bombs detonated deliberately in space, creating an electromagnetic pulse that rippled outward at the speed of light. The effect was devastating. 43 ships lost power in an instant. Their engines died, their weapons went dark, their life support systems began to fail. They tumbled through space like dead things, helpless and blind. Stared at the display screens in disbelief. The humans had detonated nuclear weapons in orbit around their own planet. They had poisoned their own space, filled it with radiation and debris just to hurt his fleet. It was insane. It was suicidal. No rational species would do such a thing. And then the ships came. They were small, smaller than even the smallest fighter. They came up from the planet's surface, hundreds of them climbing on columns of fire and smoke. They were aircraft, vehicles designed for atmospheric flight, modified with crude rockets to reach orbit. They should not have been able to survive in space at all. But they did survive, and they did not stop. The first wave reached the disabled ships in minutes. Watched, unable to comprehend what he was seeing, as the tiny craft attached themselves to hulls and began cutting through. Boarding actions. The humans were performing boarding actions, attacking ships 1,000 times more advanced than anything they had ever built. He ordered his functioning ships to fire. They did, and some of the human craft were destroyed. But there were so many, and they were so fast, and they did not seem to care about losses. Every craft that fell was replaced by 2 more. Every ship that was targeted simply dodged and weaved through the fire, as if the pilots inside did not understand that they were supposed to be afraid. The first disabled ship was captured within an hour. Its crew fought hard, warriors with centuries of experience and weapons that could kill a human with a single shot. But the humans kept coming. They lost 10 fighters for every they killed, 20, 30, and they kept coming anyway. They were not soldiers. They were a flood. By the end of the first day, 8 ships had been captured. By the end of the second day, 23. The humans were learning with every battle, adapting their tactics, improving their equipment. Weapons taken from dead appeared in human hands. Armor stripped from captured ships protected human bodies. They were using technology against figuring out in hours what should have taken years. Tried everything. He bombarded the planet's surface, destroying cities and military bases. The humans did not surrender. They dug deeper, hid better, and kept fighting. He targeted their civilian populations, hoping to break their will. Their will did not break. If anything, they fought harder. On the fifth day, he received a transmission from one of the captured ships. A human face appeared on his screen, young and tired and covered in blood that was not entirely their own. The human smiled. "You should have listened to the ambassador," the human said. "She tried to warn you." "Did not understand. What ambassador?" "Thus she told you not to come. She told you what we were." The human's smile widened. "You didn't believe her. You thought we were prey. You thought the strong ruled and the weak served. You thought that was the natural order of things." "It is the natural order," snarled. "No," the human said. "It was the natural order, but nature changes. Species evolve. The strong become weak and the weak become strong. That's what adaptation means. That's what survival means." The smile faded, replaced by something harder and colder. "You came here to conquer us. Instead, you taught us how to fight. You gave us your ships. You gave us your weapons. You gave us everything we needed to reach the stars." The transmission ended. On the ninth day, ordered a retreat. He had lost 75 ships, more than half his fleet. The humans had captured most of them, learned from them, improved upon them. His remaining vessels were damaged and low on supplies, their crews exhausted and demoralized. 72 ships made it back to space. It was the worst military defeat in history, and it had been inflicted by a species that had not even achieved interstellar travel before the battle began. The conclave convened an emergency session for the first time in 12,000 years. Representatives from all 12 species gathered in the great chamber, their faces grave and their voices hushed. Ambassador stood before them, her report glowing on 1,000 display screens. "I warned you," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was no triumph in it, only sorrow. "I told you they were different. I told you they would adapt." "Then what do we do?" demanded the representative, his pride wounded and his fear barely hidden. "We destroy them now before they grow stronger. We send every fleet we have." "You do not understand," replied. "They have already grown stronger. They captured your ships. They learned your technology. Within months they will have their own fleet. Within years they will have improved upon everything you gave them." "Then we destroy them in months, not years." "And if you fail again, if you teach them more," shook her head. "Every attack makes them stronger. Every loss makes them more determined. They are not like us. They do not calculate acceptable losses. They do not weigh costs and benefits. When they fight, they commit everything, hold nothing back. They would rather die than surrender." The chamber fell silent. For 900,000 years, the conclave had ruled the galaxy through careful balance and mutual fear. They understood threats. They knew how to deal with enemies. But this was something new. This was something they had never faced before. "What do you suggest?" the representative asked finally. Took a deep breath. "I suggest we do nothing. We watch. We wait. We let them come to us on their own terms in their own time. And when they do, we treat them not as prey but as equals." "Equals?" The representative nearly choked on the word. "They are animals, primitives. They live barely 100 years. And in those 100 years they accomplish more than some species do in 1,000, said. They are not primitives, they are something new, something the galaxy has never seen before." She paused, her glass-like features catching the light. "We can fight them and lose, or we can accept them and survive. Those are the only choices we have." The vote was close, closer than any vote in conclave history. But in the end, wisdom prevailed over pride. The fleet stood down. The weapons went cold, and the conclave waited. 18 months later, the first human ship arrived at an outpost, requesting peaceful contact. The pilot was young, barely 30 years old by human standards. She smiled at the alien beings who greeted her and extended her hand. "Hi," she said. "We're humanity, we come in peace, but please don't make us prove otherwise." Part 3. 300 years passed. To a human, that was an eternity. Generations rose and fell, children became grandparents, and the world changed in ways their ancestors could never have imagined. But to the old species of the conclave, 300 years was barely a moment, a blink of an eye in their long histories. And yet everything was different now. The Conclave of 12 had become the Conclave of 47. New species had been discovered, contacted, and welcomed into the fold, something that had never happened before in all the long of galactic civilization. The old way had been absorption or elimination. The new way was invitation, and the architects of this new way were the humans. Ambassador still served though she was ancient now even by their standards. Her glass-like body had grown cloudy with age, and she moved more slowly than she once had. But her mind remained sharp, and she had seen things that no other had ever witnessed. She had seen humans broker peace between the two species that had hated each other for longer than humanity had existed. The negotiations had taken years, and at several points, violence had seemed inevitable. But the human diplomats had refused to give up. They had listened to both sides, found common ground where none seemed to exist, and somehow convinced two ancient enemies that cooperation was better than continued conflict. When the treaty was finally signed, representatives from both species had wept. They did not weep easily. She had seen human doctors cure plagues that they had engineered ago. These were diseases designed to be incurable biological weapons of such sophistication that even their creators had lost the ability to counter them. Human scientists had studied them, analyzed them, and found solutions within decades. When asked how they had done it, one human researcher had simply shrugged and said, "We don't believe in impossible, we just believe in hard." She had seen human artists create works that changed the way other species saw the universe. Paintings that captured light in ways that seemed to bend reality. Music that spoke to emotions that had no names. Stories that made ancient beings feel young again, that reminded them of wonder and hope, and all the things they had forgotten during their long existence. The Burning Ones, who lived inside stars and rarely communicated with anyone, had emerged from their stellar homes for the first time in 10,000 years, just to witness a human symphony. And she had seen humans die. This was perhaps the most remarkable thing of all. Humans lived such brief lives, barely a century even with their most advanced medicine. They knew this. They accepted this. And somehow, instead of making them cautious, it made them brave. They threw themselves into life with an intensity that older species found almost terrifying. They loved harder, worked harder, dreamed harder. They built monuments that would outlast them by and raised children to carry on their work. They did not fear death. They feared wasting time. Now stood on the observation deck of a human warship, watching the greatest battle in galactic history unfold before her eyes. The ship was called the Perseverance. Humans named their vessels for qualities they admired, concepts they aspired to. This ship had been named for the human ability to keep going when everything seemed lost. It was a fitting name. Outside the viewports, the void swarm filled the sky. No one knew where the swarm came from. They existed in the oldest conclave records only as myth, stories told to frighten young species into obedience. They were ancient, older perhaps than the galaxy itself. They did not communicate. They did not negotiate. They simply consumed. They had destroyed 11 species before humanity had even discovered fire. They had extinguished stars and devoured civilizations beyond counting. And now they had returned. The first contact had come 3 years ago at the edge of the galactic core. A observation post had gone silent. Then a patrol fleet had vanished. Then a colony world had simply ceased to exist, its population of 2 billion reduced to nothing in less than a day. The conclave had panicked. The old species had faced many threats but nothing like this. The void swarm did not fight like normal enemies. They had no territory to defend, no resources they valued, no leaders who could be killed or convinced to surrender. They were hunger given form, a force of nature that could not be stopped any more than a star could be stopped from burning. The humans had not panicked, they had planned. It had taken time and effort and sacrifice. Human scientists had worked alongside analysts and biologists to understand the enemy. Human generals had coordinated with admirals and strategists to develop tactics. Human diplomats had traveled to every species in the conclave, even the ones that had never liked humanity, and convinced them to set aside their differences and fight together. The result was the largest fleet ever assembled in galactic history. Ships from 47 species, each bringing their own strengths, their own technologies, their own courage. And at the heart of it all, leading the charge, were the humans. Watched as waves of fighters poured from the fleet and flew toward the swarm. Many of them were human vessels, but many others were not. Warriors flew alongside pilots. Living ships fought beside crystalline vessels from the void dwellers. Species that had been enemies for now fought as brothers, united against a common foe. This was what the humans had built. Not an empire, not a hegemony, a family. The battle was terrible. The swarm adapted to everything the fleet threw at them, changing their forms, their tactics, their weapons. Ships died by the hundreds, thousands. Beings that had lived for centuries perished in instants, their lives snuffed out like candles in a hurricane. But the fleet held. Saw human pilots perform maneuvers that should have been impossible, flying into the heart of swarm formations and emerging somehow intact. She saw human soldiers board swarm hive ships, walking willingly into structures that drove other species mad with their alien geometry. She saw human commanders refuse to retreat even when the odds seemed hopeless, rallying their allies and leading them back into the fight again and again. And she saw the volunteers. This was a human word that had struggled to understand for years. In the language, there was no equivalent. The closest translation was "those who choose," but that missed something essential. Volunteers were not simply beings who made choices. They were beings who chose to sacrifice themselves for others willingly, freely, without expectation of reward or recognition. The swarm had hive minds, vast intelligences that coordinated their endless armies. Destroying these minds would cripple the swarm, perhaps permanently. But the hive minds were protected, buried deep within structures that no ship could penetrate and no weapon could damage. The humans had found a way. They had developed a device that could destroy a hive mind, but it required someone to carry it inside, to navigate the alien corridors and reach the center of the hive. The device would work, but the carrier would not survive. 3,000 humans had volunteered, not soldiers forced by orders, not criminals seeking redemption. Ordinary beings from every nation and every background who had decided that their lives were worth spending if it meant saving others. They knew they would die. They went anyway. Watched the last of the hive ships fall silent, its mind destroyed by a human who had lived barely 40 years and would never live another day. The swarm faltered, then collapsed. Without their coordinating intelligences, the endless armies became aimless, purposeless. The fleet swept through them like fire through dry grass. It was over. Around her, beings from a dozen species erupted in celebration. They cheered and wept and embraced each other, species that had been strangers or enemies forgetting their differences in the joy of survival. The galaxy had faced annihilation and emerged intact. Did not cheer, she only watched. A young officer approached her, recognized her face, or rather her ancestor's face. This officer was descended from Admiral who had led the failed invasion of Earth 3 centuries ago. They had changed much since then. They were still warriors, but they had learned that there were other ways to be strong. "Ambassador," the officer said, "I have studied the records, the old war, my ancestors' defeat." She paused, her mandibles clicking in the expression of difficult truth. "We thought we were the apex predators of this galaxy. We thought might was the measure of civilization. We were wrong." Nodded slowly. "What changed your mind?" The officer gestured toward a group of human soldiers nearby. They were laughing and crying at the same time, holding each other and their alien comrades with equal affection. One of them had lost an arm in the battle. She was joking about the replacement she would receive, claiming she would ask for one with extra fingers for better guitar playing. "They do not seek to dominate," the officer said. "They seek to connect. They make everyone around them better, stronger, more than they were. They face the void not because they do not fear it, but because they cannot bear the thought of anyone facing it alone." Smiled. She had learned the expression from humans long ago. "When I made first contact, I knew they were something unprecedented. I thought it was because they were dangerous." "Were you wrong?" "No." Watched as the one-armed human pulled a warrior into an embrace, both of them weeping freely. "They are the most dangerous species this galaxy has ever produced, but I was wrong about what made them dangerous." The officer waited. "It was never their capacity for violence," said. "It was their capacity for hope." The celebrations continued around them. Humans danced with aliens, sang songs in languages that had never been spoken together before, shared food and drink and stories. They grieved for their dead and celebrated their survival. They planned for a future that suddenly seemed brighter than anyone had dared to imagine. 300 years ago, the galaxy had tried to conquer humanity and failed. In the time since, humanity had conquered the galaxy in a different way. Not through force, though they were capable of that. Not through fear, though they could inspire that too. They had conquered through love, through hope, through the simple, stubborn belief that tomorrow could be better than today. The galaxy had met its apex predator. It looked nothing like they had expected. And it changed everything. Years later, historians would debate when exactly the galactic civilization transformed from the old conclave into the new commonwealth. Some pointed to the battle against the Void Swarm, when 47 species fought as one. Others traced it back further, to the first human ship arriving at an outpost with a smile and an extended hand. Still others argued that the transformation was ongoing, that everyday humans found new ways to bring species together and build bridges where walls had stood before. But knew the truth. The transformation had begun the moment a survey drone detected a small blue planet orbiting an unremarkable yellow star. In that moment, the fate of the galaxy had been sealed, not because the humans were the strongest or the most advanced, but because they were the most human. They were brief and fragile and flawed. They fought among themselves and made terrible mistakes. They loved too fiercely and hoped too stubbornly, and refused to accept limits that wiser species would have respected. And that was exactly why they had become the apex of everything. The galaxy was old, older than most species could truly understand, but it was also new, reborn in the image of a species that had existed for barely and of cosmic time. The future stretched out ahead, vast and unknown and full of possibility. The humans were ready for it. They always had been. That was what it meant to be human. That was what it meant to be apex.